Hello everyone, and welcome to another video review. This is one that a lot of you have been waiting for some time. This is my review of the Elder Scrolls V Skyrim. Specifically, of course, the PC version, but it's also available on Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3. This review is coming to you courtesy of Lex. He sent me this, so thank you. It is greatly appreciated. A few things I would like to mention before we get into the review proper. The first of them being simply logistics. Dawnguard and Hearthfire I will go over in my thoughts on video. I will mention them in this review, but even though I do have them, they will not factor into this ultimate point of this review. The second thing is that this is a very difficult game to review. Not because it's got a lot of content, that it's long, that it just takes a long time to play. Not even because of the technical problems I had, which were ridiculous, to be perfectly honest with you. It's because there's so much hype surrounding this game. Even before Skyrim was released, even before it was even announced, there was so much hype for it that everyone was expecting a masterpiece. And I was hoping for a return to Morrowind style. Improve upon what Morrowind did well, and maybe improve upon what Oblivion did well. Which it did do some things well, don't get me wrong. But the problem was that even with all this hype, the game came out to universal acclaim. And the problem with that wasn't so much that it came out to universal acclaim. It was that nobody noticed the flaws. Either they didn't notice, or they just completely glossed over them. Because it has a lot of flaws that are very plainly obvious. Right from the start. Even in the intro cutscene, there are flaws noticeable from the very start. And nobody seemed to actually make note of these. There's no doubt that they noticed them, because it's hard not to notice these flaws. But they chose not to mention them. That's more my problem with Skyrim than the game itself. It's not so much the game itself. It's everything surrounding it. The fan base that seems to never notice the flaws that it has. Or if they do, they act like they're insignificant when they really aren't insignificant. The problem of people acting like if you don't like Skyrim, then there's something wrong with you. And there are a lot of these people, and it disturbs me, frankly. These are my problems with Skyrim more than the game itself. It's also that it's come to represent pretty much everything that is wrong with current gaming trends. I will get to that more later on, but I just wanted to get this said right at the beginning. I would also like to mention that if you like this game, that is perfectly fine by me. Enjoy it all you wish. That doesn't make it a good game. And that also doesn't give you the right to sit there and throw expletives at me for pointing out the flaws in Skyrim. So, without further ado, let's get into the review proper. Before I go into the visuals, I would like to mention that I'm not running the high-res texture pack here. And there are a couple of reasons for that. The first one being that I want you guys to see what this game looks like with vanilla graphics. The second thing is that it doesn't really run all that well with high-res textures, just because my graphics card is a 512 meg graphics card. And so it runs out of VRAM with the high-res textures on. Eventually. It just has problems. And with the technical problems I have with this game, that's the last thing I need. So, hence why you're not seeing the high-res texture pack. Although I have seen comparisons of it, and to be honest with you, I don't really notice all that much of a difference. It looks slightly sharper, but that's about it. It's not that noticeable of a difference. It's kind of sad, actually. But anyway, what about the actual visuals of the game? I do have this on max settings, although in this recording you're actually seeing shadows have been turned off, just because of recording purposes. It makes the game run a lot smoother when I don't have shadows enabled. Suffice to say, you can already just glance at the game and tell that the color scheme in this game is lifeless, and I'll get to that in a moment. But the modeling is actually very well done. In fact, they've done a very good job of taking Oblivion's often awkward-looking modeling and making it a lot better, particularly in terms of what people look like. People in Oblivion just looked ridiculous, and they don't look that ridiculous in Skyrim. They actually look like people, albeit kind of oddly shaped people sometimes, but still people. So they did a good job of the modeling and such like that. But the textures is where that color scheme comes in. The color scheme in this game is lifeless. It is brown and gray and white for the most part. Although there is some very, very dark green that can pretty much be mistaken for a shade of gray, actually. And the landscape itself fits this color scheme very well. It is a pretty harsh landscape. Skyrim is to the far north of Tamriel. It's cold. There's not a lot there. People don't like living there. And they did a good job of conveying that, but at the same time, because it has this lifeless color scheme, it makes it very, very boring to look at. And when I see people saying Skyrim is beautiful, I sit there and wonder why they could even possibly think that. It's not a beautiful game. It is an ugly game, but that fits the landscape well. So it's this kind of double-edged sword. They did do what they set out to accomplish with the visuals, but it just makes the game not visually appealing at all. And then, of course, there's the animations, which sometimes actually take you out of the experience because they seem awkward and almost robotic in a lot of cases. And there are some that are very smooth and some that are just weird. Things like when you swing your sword in third person, well, I'll just show it to you. You can't really look at this and go, yeah, this is a good animation. You look like you're just swinging things like you have no idea what you're doing. So that's one of the annoying things about the animations. They do take you out of the experience in a lot of cases. Luckily, when you're playing in first person, you don't really notice them, but when you're in third person, you do notice them. So that's kind of annoying. But one thing that's really good about the presentation, just overall, not just the visuals, is the music. The music in this game is phenomenal. Jeremy Soule did it. He really outdid himself with as far as Elder Scrolls soundtracks go with this one. It's a wonderful soundtrack, and the problem with that is it's attached to this game. So if it were part of another game, then I would appreciate it way more than I do. But if I listen to the music by itself, it's great. But if I put it in this game, it doesn't really do anything for me. I don't really understand how that happens, but I think it's just because of the game itself. Which is a shame, because, again, the soundtrack of this game is phenomenal. Then, of course, there's the other bits of the sound design. The sound effects are wimpy. When you are sitting there swinging your sword and your axe or your whatever you're doing in any given situation, the sound effects just don't feel right. Like you're whacking things and it just makes this kind of dull thud kind of noise. It's a bit difficult to describe just why that doesn't sound right, but it just makes the combat kind of lifeless in that regard, and you just kind of sit there going, whatever. But day-to-day sounds, there's the ambient stuff, you don't really notice it. It's weird. And it seems like the world itself just isn't alive because of that sound design. It's very odd. But then there's the voice acting, which the voice acting is just bad. And you've already heard the ridiculous amounts of arrow to the knee jokes. I used to be an adventurer like you, then I took an arrow in the knee. They have odd inflections. I don't really know what accents they're going for half the time. There's no consistency to the voices whatsoever. They still go based on the character's race, but at the same time, there's weird variations with particularly the Nords, where some of them just kind of sound American, but others are trying to put on this very odd-sounding Scandinavian accent, and it doesn't really work out all that well. In fact, half the time you're sitting there wondering why there's no consistency with these accents. You would think they would all kind of sound the same, but they don't. Now, I can see the other races not sounding the same as the Nords, but the Nords should pretty much sound the same, shouldn't they? They live there. That's their homeland. Why is there so much variation in accents? I mean, obviously some of them are going to be coming from other places, but there's no consistency there. I mean, you have all these people who say they're true-born sons of Skyrim, who've been there their whole lives, and yet they have this kind of American-sounding accent. Why? Doesn't make any sense. And that's really my main problem with the voice acting. It's just, they have these odd accents, and there's so much inconsistency with them, and here and there you'll have people just say odd things. Like the guards saying the arrow to the knee stuff. And the inflections just don't sound right. So the voice acting ends up bringing the sound design as a whole down. It's kind of a shame, really. Sorry I lingered so long on the presentation, but obviously I do have quite a bit to say about this game. And it's only going to get longer from here on out, because now we're going to talk about the story and the gameplay, which are the important parts. The story takes place several hundred years after the events of the Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion, and in that time, obviously the Septim Dynasty is no more. And you now have Titus Mede II as the Emperor of the Empire of Tamriel. And between the events of Oblivion and Skyrim, you had this thing called the Great War, which was when Titus Mede II rejected a ultimatum presented to him by the Aldmeri Dominion. And this led to a war. The Aldmeri Dominion said, hey, we're not going to take this, and they invaded Cyrodiil. And did pretty well for themselves. They ended up sacking the Imperial City, and somehow they managed to get their entire army destroyed, but it still made the Empire very weak. And what ended up happening from that was the White Gold Concordat, which is the peace treaty that ended that war. It did a number of things. One, it disbanded the Blades. So the big plot point that was in Oblivion is now pretty much no more. It ceded a large part of Hammerfell to the Aldmeri Dominion, and it gave the Thalmor free reign to basically exterminate all worshippers of Talos. Now, that's a big deal, because not only do you now have the 8 divines instead of the 9 divines, but Talos is the hero god of mankind. If you don't understand how big of a deal it is for the Empire, which is led by humans, to allow the Thalmor, elves, to basically go into their lands, find people who worship the hero god of humanity, and really do whatever they want to them, then there's probably something wrong. So, not only do you have that going on, but you also have to keep in mind that in Skyrim, the Nords really like Talos. They're kind of like the first men, so to speak, if you've ever read A Song of Ice and Fire. They were kind of the first humans on the continent. And so, as a result, that's a really big deal to the Nords. Only one big problem with the way they presented it in the game. It's not that big of a deal to them. They don't care. Funny how that works out, huh? The only people who really care are those who follow Jarl Ulfric Stormcloak and his group called the Stormcloaks. They rose up against the Empire and rejected the terms of this White Gold Concordat, seeing it as a slight to them and them just bowing to the Aldmeri Dominion. How dare they? So you now have a rebellion going on, and this civil war between the Empire and, of course, the people of Skyrim that follow Ulfric Stormcloak. It's into this political situation that you are thrown. But it doesn't really matter to you. You're just kind of caught up in it. You can leave whenever you wish. But the game kind of forces a choice on you. You either side with the Stormcloaks or the Imperials. Now, you don't have to actually go and join the factions, but it kind of pushes you in that direction. And the way they've actually done that is you are being slated for execution by the Empire. So, I ask you now, why would you ever join the Empire if they tried to kill you? For who knows what? It's a good question. One that the game never answers. And one that players should ask themselves all the time. Why would I ever join the Empire? They tried to kill me. Well, you can do it. It lets you do that. But anyway, the Civil War storyline is actually a backdrop to this game. The real story is that you are Dovahkiin, the prophesied hero that will rise up against Alduin, the basically evil dragon that signals the end times, and you will be the one to defeat him. That's pretty much it. That's the storyline. You are there to beat a dragon. Yeah, that's your storyline. It's not like the Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion, where your ultimate storyline is to stop the spilling over of demons into the world, or Elder Scrolls 3 Morrowind, where you were there to just stop this malevolent deity. No, in this one, you're stopping a dragon. That's it. Seems less epic, doesn't it? That's because it is less epic. And this is where the game really falters on its storylines. The main quest line is one of the weakest, if not the weakest. Because its sole purpose is for you to fight dragons. And that may seem cool at first, until you realize that dragons are one of the easiest enemies to fight in this entire game. Particularly when you get the Dragon Rend shout. Now this is tied to you being a Dovahkiin. You can shout in the dragon tongue, the Thum. And what that basically does is it gives you various powers like Fire Breath or Dragon Rend, which renders dragons mortal, even though they pretty much are to you anyway, because you can absorb their souls. And such like that. So, this is kind of woven into the game. You'll be wandering around and finding different words of the voice and using that to get shouts and such like that. You'll be fighting dragons for most of the game. But you never really get the sense that this storyline goes anywhere. And the final boss battle is incredibly anticlimactic. You ended up looking at the prophecy itself, looking at what happened in the past to basically seal Alduin away up until now, and learn how to defeat him. Well, the problem with that is that this story really loses steam towards the end of it, and once you finish that storyline, nothing changes. There are still dragons everywhere. They are still just ravaging the countryside. Really not up until you run into them, actually. And you never really notice that the dragons are ravaging the countryside. You hear that, oh, there might be dragons swooping down at any time. But it only happens in a select few instances, and it seems very scripted. So you'll be running around, and you won't see scorched earth anywhere. You won't see destroyed buildings. You won't see what a dragon would actually do. You just occasionally run into one flying around. And it makes the story just seem incredibly weak as a result. Now, there are other storylines to this game. Like I said, the Civil War storyline is one of the big ones. And that's one you never notice up until you actually join one of the two factions and you actually explore that storyline. You can join either the Imperials or the Stormcloaks, but it doesn't matter which one you choose. There's actually a certain point in the main quest line where you're supposed to broker a peace deal. And what ended up happening on my end, I actually did that, and then went and joined the Stormcloaks and took over Skyrim. That's literally all that there is to those storylines. You change who controls what holding. That's it. You just occasionally do battles to take control of cities, and that's about it. And they make these battles seem very anticlimactic because there's only a handful of legionnaires and a handful of stormcloaks fighting it out in these various fortresses and such like that. It makes you wonder where all the big battles are. What's going on? Why is it when I go to take this city, there's only about 10 of our guys running around? Why don't we have a big army? So it's just things like that take you out of the experience and make you go, well, this doesn't really make a lot of sense. It's especially amusing when you take over a city only to find that nothing in it has changed. It's right as rain the next day, and nobody seems to notice that it's been taken over. It's kind of odd. I mean, the NPCs change. You see, instead of whatever guard it might be, you'll see Stormcloak soldiers, for instance. But it doesn't change anything. The Jarl changes, but all the quests for them are just exactly the same as they were before. And in fact, it was really awkward because my character was the Thane of Whiterun, and what that meant was that he was one of the Jarl's underlings. So when I basically took over Whiterun, nobody seemed to care that the Thane had basically gone against his Jarl. Nobody cared. It's things like this that make the world seem shallow. And while I can see the other quest lines, like, say, the Companions, which is essentially the Fighters Guild in Skyrim, or the Dark Brotherhood, except for one particular part of that, which I'll get to in a moment, and so on and so forth, while I can see those not really being a big deal to the public, I would think that the Civil War and the whole dragons ravaging the countryside thing would be a pretty big deal to them. But apparently it's not. Nobody notices. You might get occasional references to being part of a faction from an NPC, just cookie-cutter dialogue when you just walk past them or something like that. But people don't notice these things, and it gets kind of jarring when you look at this storyline and you say, well, this isn't really well woven into the game as a whole. Not to mention the storylines are pretty weak to begin with. But there is one thing that is kind of amusing about Skyrim, and that is that none of your choices actually affect anything. So you can do things like in the Dark Brotherhood questline. I'm just going to spoil it right now. One of the things you do in the Dark Brotherhood questline is kill the Emperor. And yeah, you'd think that'd be a big deal, particularly for the Imperial faction. Guess what you can do after that? Join the Imperial faction and take over Skyrim, and they do not notice. Nobody notices that the Emperor is gone. Funny how that works, huh? You see what I mean by your choices not mattering? Things remain the same. They might change what an NPC looks like, but they're not going to change what actually works out. And this is where the problem of it being considered a role-playing game comes in. It's not a role-playing game. You're not doing any role-playing. You're not changing anything around you. The world does not react to you. You just kind of do your thing, and the world sits there. And it creates an equivalent state no matter what you do. So the world feels lifeless. And you're certainly not doing any role-playing because you can do things like my character being proficient in heavy armor and just running around whacking things in the face. That's all that character did, was run around and whack things in the face. And he had no stealth abilities whatsoever. He had almost no spellcasting abilities whatsoever. The highest spellcasting skill I had was Restoration, and it was something like 26. So why is he the Archmage of the College of Winterhold? Why is he the head of the Thieves Guild? These should not happen. This is why Skyrim is not a role-playing game. You have to specifically force role-playing on it. It does not give you any chance to role-play. You, again, have to force it specifically on the game itself. Otherwise, it just lets you do whatever you want. Now, some people like that, and in some cases I like that. But in this case, when you go from being a role-playing game series to something that is not role-playing, there's a problem. It's especially a problem when people act like it's a role-playing game. It's an action game. That's fine. It is perfectly fine so long as the game accommodates that. But when you have people referring to it as role-playing when it's really not, that's a problem. So understand, that's my issue with people calling it a role-playing game. It's not. You don't do role-playing. Your choices don't matter. So whatever happens, we'll just create an equivalent state, no matter what you do. And it makes you feel like you don't really have any impact on the world around you. This is all still storyline, I might add. I'm not even talking about gameplay. This is all storyline stuff. So the writing in this game is really a big problem because it is just so weak. It doesn't accommodate for any of your choices. It doesn't let you choose anything. In reality, it's arbitrary. Now, you can choose to join things from a gameplay standpoint, and what that would mean would be that you choose to join the College of Winterhold because you want to get certain spells or something like that. Although you can generally just find whatever you need in the world around you. I cannot tell you how many spell tomes for the spell Flame I came across. There are just so many of them, and you get that from the very beginning of the game. You can join the Companions to eventually become a werewolf, actually. That's something I'll get to in a moment. You can join the Thieves Guild and get access to some things associated with that, like fences, for instance, but that's not really that big of a deal. And you can also join the Dark Brotherhood, and you would think that would be one of the more interesting quest lines because it is one of the more interesting quest lines in Oblivion. It's actually not, for the most part, because most of what you're doing is eliminating nondescript characters who don't really seem to be fleshed out at all. But suffice to say, from a gameplay standpoint, it is the most interesting quest line in the entire game. And that's saying something, because there are quite a few quest lines in this game. So, you have all this stuff that's weak from a story standpoint. What about the gameplay? Well, the gameplay is all over the place on numerous fronts. On the one hand, it keeps a lot of what Oblivion did with the combat system requiring fatigue for power attacks, but they did change it to so when you just do normal swings, you no longer use fatigue. I don't really know why they did that, but they did. It's still a more kinetic combat system than Morrowind's was, which is perfectly fine by me. The problem being that the combat ends up devolving into just clicking over and over and over again until something falls over. Occasionally you'll do this kind of fancy execution move, but for the most part they're not really that impressive, and it doesn't really seem to trigger all that much. There are mods to increase that, but I didn't install them. And so, not only can you do what you basically did in Oblivion, but you now are able to dual wield. And you can wield a spell and a weapon, or two weapons if you want, or you can use a two-handed weapon, or a weapon and a shield, or a shield and a spell, or two spells. Or you can even use two of the same spell, but when you cast them together, it creates a more powerful version of that spell if you have the requisite perk in your skill tree. This is another thing that they have changed from Oblivion. Instead of the skill system that you had in that, they have first off removed a couple of things. For instance, blade, axes, and blunts have now been combined into two things: one-handed and two-handed. Now, you may think that's streamlining. In some ways, yes, but from a logical standpoint, it doesn't really make all that much sense, because an axe and a mace handle completely differently from a sword or a dagger. It's things like that that just kind of render the immersion odd. You have to kind of put it away in your brain. You can go, no, this doesn't make any sense. If you know anything about these, of course. On top of that, they've also changed up a few of the things in the game, like they now have a pickpocketing skill. Security's been turned into lockpicking. They've removed mysticism, I believe. And the spellcasting system in general has been completely overhauled. I'll get to that in a moment. But most of these skills are pretty comparable to what they had in Oblivion. They did also remove acrobatics and athletics, so you no longer have those. It's all fairly practical skills for the most part. although they did also add in smithing and remove armorer, because you no longer have the durability system on your equipment. Which, personally, that's fine. I didn't really mind it being in there, but it didn't really make all that much sense from a casual gamer standpoint, I guess. So, I'm fine with it not being in the game. That's not really that big of a deal, but it did change things a bit. And enchanting is there as well, so you can do that. As far as what's different from the way the series has done it before, you can no longer create your own spells, which is a problem, because now you have to use all the cookie cutter spells that they give you. Most of which actually end up being very, very weak by the time you get to the end game. Because once you get to a certain point, the game stops giving you spells. And while everything else is getting more and more powerful around you, you're not. Your spells are remaining constant. So, you may still have a spell that does barely any damage whatsoever, but unfortunately, you can't get anything better. Now, admittedly, it was pretty easy to break the game if you knew what you were doing with the spell creation system before, but now with the lack of it, it makes mages pretty underpowered. Because, again, once you get to that end game, they're very weak. They don't have spells that are suitable for the task at hand anymore. Kind of odd. Because the equipment that, say, a melee fighter uses gets better and better over time as they improve it with their smithing abilities and enchantments and such like that. Stealth in the game is very overpowered because you get sneak attacks, and the AI never seems to notice you're there. In fact, there's one perk, I believe, that allows you to, whenever you go into stealth mode, it actually renders you invisible for a short time. And so people just sit there and go, "What happened? Where did he go?" And it creates for very comical situations. Not to mention your sneak attack can get pretty ridiculous multipliers and basically take out enemies in one hit, no matter where you are. Although, when I got to a certain point as a fighter, I ended up taking things out in one or two hits no matter what it was, unless it was a very, very powerful enemy, in which case it took a few hits. So, it's just the way they've worked this out doesn't really make all that much sense. It kind of renders mages to be a much less viable option than fighters, and especially stealthy characters, who are especially using archery because that allows them to stay as far away from the enemy as possible. There's also no attributes in this game anymore except for health, magicka, and stamina. So instead of putting points into strength or dexterity or something like that, you're now putting them into health, magicka, and stamina. Now that kind of removes modifiers to how much damage you do, how much faster you move, that sort of thing, so it takes a lot of getting used to. They have added in a sprinting ability, where if you hold the button down and move forward, then you sprint. Now, you don't really go that much faster, and it drains your fatigue, but you can do it now. Horse riding is back, the system for that being pretty much exactly the same as it was in Oblivion, except for horses moving slower now. I don't really know why, they just do. And they also brought back one really big problem from Oblivion, and that was quest markers. I'll get to that more in a moment. But suffice to say, they don't really add all that much to the formula, they just changed up a lot of the way you do things. One thing they did add to the game that is very noteworthy is the crafting system. You can now craft your own equipment. And this is kind of a problem, because it's very easy to break the game by doing so. For instance, by the end of the game, I had a dwarven sword that did more damage than a Daedric sword. The Daedric being the best thing you can get in the game. And that's kind of a problem, because that really devalues the items that you can pick up, especially the Daedric artifacts, which the game pretty much throws at you like candy now. So, you can make crafted equipment that's just outright better than pretty much everything you can get in the game, because you can improve your crafted equipment. You can also improve normal equipment, by the way, up to the point where it does ridiculous amounts of damage and such like that. We're talking about 40 damage for a simple steel sword, or sometimes more than that. It's crazy. And as a result, the crafted equipment becomes a very overpowered way to play the game. You can also enchant that equipment to make it even more powerful. You see where things weren't really thought through all that well. It's very easy to break this game from a mechanics standpoint. And the perk system doesn't really do anything to help that. There are certain perks in the game that render things ridiculous, like I said, the stealth ability that allows you to basically drop into stealth mode and go invisible for a short period of time. Or the heavy armor skill that makes armor that you're wearing actually weigh nothing and doesn't slow you down, although that's a good thing for the most part. Carry weight is still actually a problem in this game for some bizarre reason, so you'll notice that a lot, where you'll be sitting there and you'll be laden down with all this loot that you found, and you have to go back and sell it all or put it in chests or something. And in fact, the game throws so much loot at you that you will never have a gold problem. You can just sell tons and tons of stuff that you'll find in the ruins or whatever the game throws at you to have no problem with money whatsoever in this game. So you have all these things from a mechanical standpoint that bring the game down, and almost unintentionally so. Like, they were well-intentioned, but they just didn't work out all that well. And for some reason haven't been balanced out since. Again, I don't know why. But you also have some just odd things that don't really make a lot of sense. And one of these is, of course, the UI, which is terrible in its base form. Now, I mostly play with Sky UI. It's a mod that renders the actual UI usable, as opposed to what you get in Skyrim, which is text and lists and nothing else. As in, well, just look at it from the footage that you're seeing. It's a list of categories, which you click on the category, or if you're using a controller, which is probably more likely because the mouse doesn't usually work all that well in these menus. But you click on the option that you want for your category. It goes in and pulls up all the items that you got in a long list, and you have to scroll through the entire list. Now you may be going, DW, it's PC, can't you just do hotkeys for your various things? No, you can't. You get a quick menu, which you press the button and it brings up the menu, and then you have to scroll through that menu to find what you want. So, I don't know really who designed this UI, but it doesn't work all that well. It's one of those things where it doesn't really make any sense. It should work, but it doesn't. And as a result, it becomes more annoying than anything else. Hence why I have Sky UI. It's much better. There's also systems in the game that don't really make a lot of sense just because they're there, and one of these is marriage. It's completely pointless. There's no reason to get married in this game. It's just like in Fable. You might as well not do it. Although, unlike in Fable, you can't have a spouse every single place you go. That'd be kind of awkward. But the adoption mechanic is also completely useless. Why would you do it in this game? There's no point to it. And so, what you end up having, from a mechanical standpoint, is all of the stuff that blends together to just make a very mechanically unsound game. Stuff that, in theory, sounds good. Again, kinetic combat, dual wielding, all this stealth, archery, magic mixing together to create a very dynamic combat system. Or so you'd think. Because you'll just end up picking one thing and sticking to it. Like, for instance, I picked melee and stuck to it, and it worked out very, very well. Even against dragons. Makes a lot of sense. But anyway, mechanically this game is just unsound. It's not horrible from a mechanics standpoint, but it's very unsound, and there's a lot of stuff in it that just makes you wonder why it's there. But on top of that, you have certain streamlining, so to speak, or actually I should refer to it as dumbing down, that renders the game problematic. For instance, the quest design in this game. It's extremely linear, which is normal for the Elder Scrolls series. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. But they've rendered it so that, unlike in Morrowind, where you would be given information about where you needed to go and what you needed to do in your journal, which admittedly back then was very difficult to navigate, and they did fix that later on. But In this game, you get such vague directions that you have to follow the quest marker. You just have to accept that your character just knows where they have to go. It's immersion breaking. On top of that, it basically treats you like an idiot. That was really my main problem with this game. It treats you like an idiot. It points at things and goes, this is exactly what you need to do, and if you try to turn off that quest marker, you will have no idea where you need to go or what you need to do. Because you'll get quest directions such as, say, find Bjorn. Literally, that's all you'll get as your descriptive text for this. Find Bjorn. And you don't know where Bjorn is, so you have to look on your map and find where the quest marker is. Go to the quest marker, and just go through this extremely linear process, back and forth, back and forth. On top of that, quest design is so simplistic in this game, you'll basically be doing one of two things. Running around delivering things, or running around in dungeons, with the dungeons being all barrows full of Draugr, or spiders. The game's really fond of spiders, actually. And that's pretty much the majority of this game, running around and whacking things in the face in barrows, or delivering things. Sounds riveting. Which is why I say the Dark Brotherhood quest line is the most interesting, because you're actually going around and trying to carry out some cool stuff. Whereas with everything else, it's go to dungeon, whack thing in face. Even for the quests that it wouldn't even make sense for that. For instance, the Mages Guild. What do you do most of the time? You run around a barrow and whack things in the face. Or you zap things with your spells, which are very underpowered. What do you do in the Thieves Guild? You run around and whack things in the face. Or backstab them, or shoot them with your bow. That sounds like thievery to me. Certainly. See, these are the kinds of things that just drive me nuts about Skyrim. It's stuff that doesn't make any sense. From any standpoint. If I join the Thieves Guild, I expect to be doing stuff that would make sense for the Thieves Guild. You know, sneaking into places and finding rare artifacts, or finding information that we can use, or something like that. I don't expect to go into standard dungeon crawls. That's what this game is. It is dungeon crawling. Nothing but dungeon crawling. And if you say, well, the point is to explore, well, congratulations. You found yet another cavern full of giant spiders, or a barrow full of Draugr. Now, you might occasionally run across a Dwemer ruin, but they're few and far between, and they actually have fewer rewards for exploring them than the barrows do, because at least barrows tend to give you words of power. So you have these weird things with the design of the levels and the quests that just treat you like a moron, and it treats the game like it's stupid. Like it was designed for people who have absolutely no idea what they're doing except for just pressing the trigger buttons or clicking the left mouse button over and over and over again. Like that's all you really do. And so, gone are the things like Morrowind's puzzles, or even Oblivion's puzzles, where you actually had to kind of use your brain and figure things out, like the Shrine of Vivec in Morrowind, where one of the puzzles actually had you gave you a vague clue, which was basically saying to drown yourself, and you had to figure that out on your own. Whereas in Skyrim, the only puzzles that you will ever see are puzzle doors and switch puzzles. Switch puzzles being that you have to arrange certain obelisk-type structures in certain areas into certain patterns. And it outright gives you the answers in those locations. So, what's the point there? And on the puzzle doors, you can just flip the claw around that you need to open the door with, and what do you know? There's the solution to the puzzle right there. The game treats you like an idiot. It gives you the puzzle solutions right there. It gives you these quest designs that are so incredibly linear, it's impossible to fail them. In fact, it's impossible to fail at this game at all. The only thing you can do in this game that would be considered failure is die. And you can do that, especially if you put it on the higher difficulty settings. That is one thing that they did a bit better than Oblivion did. Oblivion was way too easy. Skyrim is still easy, but if you turn the difficulty up, at least it takes longer to take things down. But in Skyrim, it is literally impossible to fail, because not only are major NPCs unkillable, but the quest designs are so linear, and it is literally impossible to make people hate you enough to do anything about it. You might be able to get people to attack you, but it doesn't really matter. They'll just ignore it later on and act like you never did anything to them. It is literally impossible to annoy the NPCs enough that they will go against you. Contrast that with things like in, say, Morrowind or even Oblivion, where if you said the wrong things to somebody or you took their things or something like that, then they would get mad at you, and some of them would outright refuse to talk to you. You might be able to win them back over by persuasion, but other than that, you had just closed off that entire dialogue with them. Or maybe the quest with them. And certain quests in, say, Morrowind had certain conditions that you had to fulfill, otherwise you would fail the quest. That is no longer the case in Skyrim. You cannot fail at anything. In fact, gone is the persuasion mechanic. Although speechcraft is in this game, it's pointless. There is no reason to use it. And in fact, when you use it, you're not even sure if it worked or not half the time, because the dialogue just continues on like it doesn't really matter. So ultimately, they put in something that's completely useless and rendered the dialogue absolutely pathetic. Not only from that, but also from the fact that most NPCs only have 2 or 3 dialogue lines with you. So you can't really get all that much information from them. They'll barely tell you anything, even the time of day. And so you'll just be wandering around talking to these characters who are very lifeless, and this world that seems empty. It's hard to explain how empty this world feels despite having a lot of stuff in it. It feels shallow. You have all of these elements blending together, and the game treating you like a complete moron is one of the worst things about it. Because not only does it treat you like a moron, it just holds your hand through everything. Now, part of that is where I bring in the DLCs, because there's one thing in particular that just is ridiculous. You can become a werewolf in Skyrim. You can also become a vampire. And with the Dawnguard expansion, it gives you a very easy out for vampirism. You can just cure it pretty much whenever you want to. On top of this, you can become a vampire lord in Dawnguard, even if you're a werewolf. Now, it's well known in the lore that werewolves and vampires hate each other, and people hate vampires and werewolves. They hate them! So, there should be repercussions for that, but nobody even notices if you're a werewolf or a vampire. Particularly if you're a vampire. If you're a werewolf, they might say you smell like wet dog, but that's it. There's nothing else that happens. Whereas, if you're a vampire, nobody notices at all. So, these are oddities. And when you're a werewolf, you are immune to disease. Why are you able to contract vampirism? That makes no sense. Moreover, why would they bestow the gift of vampirism on a mangy dog like a werewolf? It doesn't make sense. Things like that is just completely removes immersion from the game. And so, what you get is an extremely shallow game that devolves into nothing more than whacking things in the face the entire game. The quests are half randomly generated and end up just being go to dungeon, whack things in face, find item, return. And this happens regardless of whether it's a randomly generated quest or an actual main quest for a faction or for the main quest line. pretty much all you're doing is running around whacking things in the face. And if you're not whacking things in the face, you're running around in this very, very open but empty world, trying to get to places to unlock the fast travel ability. And it takes a long time to get to places. Skyrim's a very large game, and so it takes you a long time to move from point A to point B. And it's not like Oblivion, where you can go to any of the main cities in the game right off the bat. No, you have to go to the city first to unlock fast travel to it. Not to mention, by the end of the game, you can be so proficient at everything that nothing can stand in your way. You can pick any lock. You can defeat any foe. It doesn't matter. And by the end of the game, I was Thane of pretty much every single holding in Skyrim. And I didn't do anything from it. All it really gets you is the ability to say to guards, hey, I'm the Thane, back off. And they'll do it. That's it. Now, as far as the shouts go, from a mechanical standpoint, they're just not that useful. They don't really do all that much that could be considered useful. The one that everybody talks about is Fuzro Da, which sends things flying. But there are certain enemies that completely resist it, and some enemies can throw it at you. So, whoop-de-doo. But the only really useful shout is Dragon Rend, which causes dragons to land. Makes them very easy pickings. So, you have just rendered what is supposed to be a big, scary, very difficult enemy to defeat into something that is a laughingstock and extremely pathetic. In fact, the more dangerous enemies than dragons in this game are bandits and giants. Giants, which, in a fairly amusing note, can launch you into the air with a single strike. At least at low level, anyway. And the bandits just, they swarm you, and they take a lot of hits before they go down, especially on higher difficulties. It's kind of odd when you have what is supposed to be a very powerful enemy not being a powerful enemy. I don't really understand it. And so you have all these problems. The game dragging you throughout, not even holding your hand, it's dragging you by the hand. Treating you like a complete idiot as far as the puzzles go, as far as the quest design goes, acting like you can't figure anything out on your own. The mechanics that are at best clunky, because they just don't work out as they should, even though they do somewhat work. And you also have extremely pathetic writing, and ultimately no role-playing in the game whatsoever unless you specifically force it on the game. Because, again, nothing has any requisites. You can do whatever you want. It's a sandbox action game. And, again, this would be fine if it were not so broken and stupid. Not stupid in the sense of the game actually just being dumb. That's fine. Mindless fun is perfectly fine. It's stupid in the sense of it doesn't make any sense for it to be as dumbed down and shallow as it actually is. That is my main beef with Skyrim. It is not that I personally don't like the game, which I don't. It is that it treats me like an idiot. It is that it treats gamers like idiots. And acts like you have to be dragged through the game by all these quest markers and such. We are intelligent human beings. We can figure things out. We like figuring things out for ourselves. That was part of what made Morrowind so good. That was part of what made Daggerfall so good. Figuring things out on your own. Having the world react to you. Having your choices mean something, whether it be from a mechanical standpoint or from a story standpoint. That was why Morrowind and Daggerfall are the best games in the series. And that is why Skyrim is the worst. I give it a 1 out of 5. Thanks for watching.